35 years ago, my sister Diane stole two things from me. The first was the man I was about to marry. The second was our family's $2 million trust fund. They vanished together, leaving me with nothing but my aging parents and the ruins of my life. Now, here we were, in the heavy silence of our late father's law office. She leaned across the mahogany table, her diamonds flashing. "Poor you," she whispered, still stuck in that old inn. "We've lived a full life." She had no idea our father's last will was not about forgiveness. It was an invoice, long overdue. At 68 years old, you learn the difference between pain and its echo. The sharp agony of my sister's betrayal had faded decades ago. What remained was a quiet, steady resolve, a feeling that had settled deep in my bones. I sat straight in the stiff leather chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap. The air in the office was thick with the scent of old books and fresh grief, a smell I knew all too well. Beside me, my husband Samuel was a silent, solid presence. He didn't hold my hand. He didn't need to. His being there was enough. We had prepared for this day for years. The heavy office door opened, and they walked in. Diane and Arthur. They wore their wealth like armor. Arthur, with his perfectly tailored suit, had the same easy smile he'd used to charm my parents into financial ruin. Diane's hair was a helmet of expensive blonde, her face a mask of careful preservation. They moved as if they owned the room, their confidence an invading force, displacing the somber air with their entitlement. They offered me a nod that was more of a dismissal than a greeting. They took their seats opposite us. After a moment of feigned sympathy for our father, Diane fixed her gaze on me, her eyes sweeping over my simple black dress. Her whisper, meant to sound like a private confidence, was loud enough for the entire room to hear. "It must have been so hard for you," she said, her voice dripping with false pity. "All those years, just stuck in that dusty old inn while we were out there, really living." I did not flinch. I did not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. The younger Eleanor would have shattered. The Eleanor of today simply met her sister's gaze and held it, letting the silence answer for her. There was no anger left, only a profound sense of finality. My eyes flickered to Samuel, a silent message passing between us. "It has begun." In front of us, the lawyer, Mr. Gable, cleared his throat. He picked up the will, the crisp rustle of the pages sounding like the start of a countdown. As Mr. Gable began to read the preamble of the will, my mind drifted back 35 years, to a summer that felt like a lifetime ago. The world was a brighter place then, or maybe it was just my own youthful ignorance that painted it in such hopeful colors. At 33, I was the responsible daughter, the one who stayed close to home in our small coastal town in Maine. I managed the books for my father's hardware store, organized family holidays, and was the dependable rock my parents leaned on. My life was unfolding exactly as planned. I was engaged to a man I believed I loved, Arthur, and our wedding was just months away. My parents, both sensible people who had built their life on hard work and careful planning, wanted to secure our futures. That summer, they established the Wilson Family Trust. It was funded with $2 million, the entirety of their life savings, and the proceeds from selling a tract of commercial land. It was a staggering sum, intended to provide for both me and Diane, ensuring we would never have to worry. I remember the day we all sat in this very same law office with a younger Mr. Gable, as my father explained his vision. "This isn't just money," he had said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's a foundation, a head start for your own families." My younger sister, Diane, had always been different. Where I was steady, she was a storm. She possessed a restless beauty and a charm that could disarm anyone. She had left our small town for the city years earlier, always chasing something bigger, something more exciting. Throughout our childhood, she had a habit of wanting whatever was mine, from a favorite doll to my circle of friends. I believed we had outgrown that childish rivalry. I was wrong. When I introduced her to Arthur, she was effusive in her praise. "He's so ambitious." Eleanor, so sophisticated, she would say. I watched her laugh a little too loudly at his jokes, touch his arm a little too often. I dismissed it as Diane just being Diane, her natural charisma at work. Arthur, for his part, seemed to bask in the attention. He was a man who thrived on admiration, and my sister offered it in abundance. My trust in them was absolute. I was the older sister, the one who was supposed to be wise, but I saw nothing but what I wanted to see. I saw my fiancé, handsome and driven. I saw my younger sister, seemingly happy for my good fortune. I never saw the architects of my own ruin sitting right across the dinner table from me. The trust was meant to be our family's greatest act of love. Instead, it became the weapon they would use to sever me from my own life, leaving a wound that would take decades to heal. The memory was so vivid, it felt like yesterday. The shift was subtle at first, an insidious creep of change disguised as helpfulness. It began a few months after the trust was established. During a family dinner, Arthur casually suggested that he could help my father manage the portfolio. He spoke of diversification and aggressive growth strategies, using a vocabulary that was both impressive and slightly intimidating to my parents. My father, who understood hardware and handshakes better than stocks and bonds, was visibly relieved. He saw it as a generous offer from his future son-in-law, a way to ensure the fund was in capable hands. I felt a small, unexplainable flicker of unease, but I pushed it down. It seemed ungrateful to question his intentions. Soon, Arthur was spending several evenings a week at my parents' house, spreading glossy charts and statements across their mahogany dining table. I would occasionally look over his shoulder, and the documents felt alien to me. There were invoices from consulting firms I had never heard of, wire transfers for what he called market research in cities we had no connection to. The numbers were large, the descriptions vague. When I pointed one out, a significant payment to a company named Apex Solutions, he simply smiled his easy smile. He explained it was a necessary part of liquidating certain assets to reinvest in higher yield ventures. His explanations were always smooth, a river of financial jargon that made my questions seem foolish and unsophisticated. The unease grew from a flicker into a knot in my stomach. I decided to talk to Diane during one of her weekend visits home. I found her in our old shared bedroom, and I tried to voice my concerns carefully. I told her I felt excluded from the process, that the transactions seemed opaque. She listened with a look of patronizing patience. "Eleanor," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "you're just not used to this level of finance. Arthur knows what he's doing. He's making our money grow. You worry too much." Her words were meant to soothe, but they felt like a dismissal. She made me feel small, as if my instincts were a product of ignorance. She insisted that I should be grateful Arthur was taking on such a burden for our family. A few weeks later, I found another folder of paperwork Arthur had left behind. Inside was a document authorizing a large transfer. At the bottom, next to my father's looping signature, was a second one required for approval. It was my sister's. Her name was signed with a confident, decisive flourish. I felt a cold dread wash over me. She wasn't just defending him. She was an active participant. I was no longer just feeling excluded. I was being systematically locked out. And my own sister was holding the key. The final 2 weeks before my wedding were supposed to be a whirlwind of joyous last-minute details. The flowers had been confirmed. My dress was hanging in my closet, a beautiful testament to a future I believed was certain, but the knot of dread that had formed in my stomach weeks earlier had now become a cold, heavy stone. Arthur had been distant, and I hadn't spoken to Diane since our tense conversation. I told myself it was just pre-wedding jitters, a normal reaction to such a life-changing event. I was clinging to the illusion of normalcy with everything I had. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Arthur was supposed to meet me at the town hall to pick up our marriage license. He never arrived. I called his apartment, but the phone rang unanswered. I called Diane's number in the city, but it went straight to a disconnected message. A primal panic began to set in. I drove to my parents' house, a terrible premonition gripping me. The house was quiet, too quiet. On the kitchen table, the heart of our family home, sat a single white envelope. My name was written on the front in Diane's familiar, elegant script. My hands shook as I opened it. The note inside was not long. There were no apologies, no heartfelt explanations. It was a cold, clinical statement of fact. It said they were together, that they had been in love for months. It claimed the family trust was their only way to get a clean start, away from what they called the suffocating small-town life I had chosen. The final line burned into my memory. It insisted this was for the best. My mother found me standing there, the letter trembling in my hand. My father read it over my shoulder, his face turning a shade of gray I had never seen before. He didn't speak. He simply took his car keys from the hook by the door. The drive to the bank was silent, each of us lost in a private world of disbelief and horror. The bank manager, a man who had known our family for years, led us into his glass-walled office with a somber expression. He listened as my father explained the situation, his voice strained. The manager typed quietly at his computer, his professional demeanor slowly crumbling as he read the screen. He cleared his throat and informed us the account had been closed out 3 days earlier. Every last dollar had been transferred to an anonymous offshore account. The final balance, he confirmed, was 0. In that sterile, quiet office, my world did not just crack. It disintegrated. I had not only lost my fiancé and my sister, I had lost my future, my security, and the life savings my parents had worked their entire lives to build. The betrayal was absolute. It was a void from which I was certain I would never recover. The weeks that followed were a blur of shame and suffocating silence. The news of my canceled wedding and the reason for it spread through our small town like a wildfire. There were whispers in the grocery store, pitying glances from old family friends. But the gossip was nothing compared to the quiet devastation inside my own home. My father, a man who had always been a bastion of strength, seemed to shrink. He aged a decade in a month, the betrayal having stolen his vitality, along with his savings. My mother moved through the house like a ghost, her grief a constant, palpable presence. They needed me. Fleeing was not an option. My own heartbreak was a luxury I could not afford to indulge. For months, my life was a cycle of caring for them, ensuring they ate, managing the household, and absorbing their silent sorrow. The future I had planned was gone, and I could not yet imagine a new one. One afternoon, seeking a moment of peace, I walked down to the coast. The ocean was gray and turbulent, matching my own inner turmoil. My gaze fell upon a derelict building perched on a bluff overlooking the water. It was the old Seafoam Inn, a place that had been boarded up and abandoned for as long as I could remember. It was a wreck, with peeling paint, a sagging porch, and windows that stared out like vacant eyes. In that moment of seeing something so utterly broken, something shifted inside me. I did not see decay. I saw potential. I saw a project, a purpose, something to pour my shattered energy into. I saw a way to build something new from wreckage. With the small amount of personal savings I had managed to keep, and a modest loan secured against the only asset we had left, our family home, I bought the inn. People thought I was foolish. They saw a heartbroken woman making a desperate, irrational choice. But for me, it was survival. The work was brutal. I spent my days tearing down rotting plaster, sanding floors until my hands were raw, and learning about plumbing. From old books I borrowed from the town library. Every swing of a hammer, every scraped layer of old paint felt like an act of defiance. I was not just renovating a building, I was rebuilding myself. The physical exhaustion was a welcome anesthetic for the emotional pain. Slowly, painfully, the inn began to transform, and with it, so did I. The victim who had been left with nothing was being replaced by a woman who was learning to build everything she needed with her own two hands. The inn became my sanctuary, a fortress I was constructing one board, one nail, one determined breath at a time. Years bled into one another, each marked by the rhythm of the seasons at the inn. The Seafoam Inn, once a ruin, was now a beloved local landmark. It had a reputation for its quiet elegance, its stunning ocean views, and the unwavering dedication of its owner. I found a different kind of life than the one I had planned. It was a life of quiet satisfaction, built not on a foundation of wealth, but on hard work and resilience. My parents lived out their final years in peace, and I was there with them until the very end. The sharp edges of the past had softened, but the scar of the betrayal remained, a silent part of my history. I had long given up on the idea of romantic love. The inn was my partner, my passion, my entire world. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, a guest checked in who was different from the usual tourists. His name was Samuel. He was a man in his late 60s, with kind, intelligent eyes and a calm, reassuring presence. He told me he was a forensic accountant, semi-retired, and was simply traveling the coastline for a few weeks before settling down for good. He was supposed to stay for 2 nights. He ended up staying for 2 weeks. We fell into a comfortable routine of long talks in the evenings, sitting in the inn's library overlooking the sea. I found myself telling him things I hadn't spoken of in decades. I told him about the inn, my parents, and eventually, the story of the trust. I did not tell it with anger or self-pity, but as a simple statement of my past, like recounting a historical event. He listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving mine. He did not offer empty platitudes or easy reassurances. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that struck me to my core. He told me that in his line of work, he had learned that financial records have a long memory. They don't forget, even when people do. We were married a year later, a small, quiet ceremony on the inn's porch at sunset. It was a partnership of equals, a love built on mutual respect and a deep, quiet understanding. One evening, months after we were married, he came to me with a folder. He had, with my permission, started looking into the old trust documents I had kept locked away. He told me he had found something, a thread. It wasn't about revenge, he explained. It was about truth. He believed a great injustice had been done, and he wanted to see the full picture. It was not a rescue mission. It was a quiet collaboration, a shared search for a truth that had been buried for over 30 years. For the first time, the faint, distant hope for justice began to feel like a tangible possibility. Mr. Gable's voice droned on, a low hum that faded into the background. As my mind returned to the present, the memories of the past 35 years had coalesced into a single, sharp point of focus. I looked across the polished mahogany table at my sister. The years had not been entirely kind to Diane. Beneath the expensive makeup and the carefully styled hair, I saw fine lines of discontent around her eyes, and a tightness around her mouth that her practiced smile could not quite conceal. Arthur, too, had changed. The charismatic charm of his youth had hardened into a brittle arrogance. He sat with his arm draped possessively over the back of Diane's chair, a king presiding over a kingdom he believed he had conquered. They were a portrait of smug satisfaction. They thought this meeting was a mere formality, the final act in a play where they had already won. They believed my father's death was simply an opportunity to collect whatever scraps might be left of the family estate. Their glances in my direction were filled with a condescending pity I found almost clinical in its cruelty. They saw a woman who had been left behind, who had settled for a small life while they had soared. They had no concept of the strength it had taken to stay, to rebuild, to care for the parents that they had abandoned. They saw my quiet life as a failure, a confirmation of their own superior choices. I felt Samuel shift slightly beside me. It was a minute movement, almost imperceptible. But I knew what it meant. It was a signal. The time for quiet observation was ending. The years of our patient, meticulous work of piecing together a 35-year-old puzzle were about to culminate in this room. All the while, I maintained my composure. My calm was not an act. It was a fortress built over decades. It was the deep, unshakable peace that comes from knowing the truth when everyone else in the room is living a lie. Diane leaned forward again, her voice a stage whisper. She spoke about their winter home in Florida, their recent trip to Europe. Every word was a carefully chosen barb, designed to highlight the chasm between our lives. She was not just speaking to me, she was performing for Arthur, for the lawyer, for the ghosts in the room, reinforcing the narrative she had told herself for years. The narrative where she was the victor. I simply watched her, my expression unreadable. I felt like an audience member watching the final scene of a tragedy, knowing the devastating plot twist that the characters on stage could not yet see. The storm was here, and they were basking in the sunshine, completely unaware of the reckoning that was about to break over their heads. Mr. Gable adjusted his glasses, his gaze sweeping over the four of us before settling on the document in his hands. He began to read in a slow, deliberate cadence, detailing the disposition of my father's personal effects. His fishing boat, his collection of antique tools, they were small, sentimental bequests to cousins and old friends. Diane shifted impatiently in her chair, her polished fingernails tapping a restless rhythm on the mahogany table. She was waiting for the main event, the part where the real assets were divided. Then, Mr. Gable paused. He took a sip of water, and the small sound seemed to echo in the profound silence of the room. He turned to a new page, one that was visibly different from the others. It was a single sheet of stationery, filled with my father's familiar, strong handwriting. "This," Mr. Gable said, his voice taking on a new weight, "is a codicil, a final instruction written by your father himself, just 3 months ago." He began to read my father's words aloud. "To my daughter, Diane." The lawyer's voice was now just a vessel for my father's. It felt as if he were in the room with us. "35 years ago, you chose your path. Today, I am giving you one final opportunity to face the truth of that choice." Diane's expression faltered, the smug confidence replaced by a flicker of confusion. Arthur sat up straighter, a defensive posture settling over him. The letter continued, "I have always believed that truth, no matter how long it is buried, will eventually find its way to the light. Therefore, in accordance with my final wishes, I will now yield the floor." Mr. Gable looked up from the page, his eyes moving directly to my husband. "I hereby instruct my legal counsel to defer to my son-in-law, Samuel, who has, at my personal request, prepared a special financial statement for this occasion." A collective intake of breath. The air in the room crackled with sudden, sharp tension. Diane's face, a mask of careful composure just moments before, now registered shock. She stared at Samuel as if seeing him for the first time. Arthur's confident demeanor shattered completely, replaced by a pallor that spread across his face like a stain. This was not a coincidence. This was not a stroke of luck for me, or a misfortune for them. This was a plan, a meticulously orchestrated event, set in motion by the very man they believed could no longer touch them. In that moment, the power in the room shifted. tilting irrevocably. It wasn't just a reading of a will anymore. It was a reckoning, personally arranged by my father from beyond the grave. His love and his demand for justice had reached across time to have the final word. Samuel rose from his chair with a quiet dignity. He moved not with the drama of a prosecutor, but with the calm precision of a man who deals only in facts. He placed his worn leather briefcase on the table and opened it. Retrieving a single, slender file, he did not look at Arthur. His gaze, clear and unwavering, was fixed solely on my sister. "Diane." "Wilson," he began, his voice professional but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "It's a common misconception that the $2 million trust was emptied in a single transaction. Our investigation, conducted at your late father's request, shows something far more deliberate." Diane's mouth opened slightly, a silent protest forming, but no words came out. Samuel continued, his tone methodical. "The fund was not stolen. It was bled dry, over a period of 5 years, through a complex web of shell corporations and fraudulent invoices." He slid the first document across the table. It was an invoice from a company I had seen all those years ago, Apex Solutions. Only now, it was accompanied by incorporation papers. "The listed sole proprietor," he said, "was a name you might recognize, Arthur's name. But a company like this needs more than one signature to seem legitimate, especially when billing a family trust." He then laid out another paper, a bank authorization form. "It was here," he said, "that the fraud became a true conspiracy." Arthur finally found his voice. A blustering, desperate sound. "This is ridiculous. It's a fabrication." Samuel ignored him completely, his attention still locked on my sister. He pointed to a line on the authorization form. "This signature," he said, "the one that approved the payment, the one that made the whole scheme possible, is yours." "Diane." My sister stared at her own looping, confident signature, written in ink 30 years prior. It was undeniable. He then produced another document, and another. Each one was a different shell company, a different fraudulent charge. And each one bore her signature, a repeating monument to her complicity. She was not a passive beneficiary. She was the key that unlocked every door. The final document Samuel placed on the table was a wire transfer confirmation, the last of the money, being moved from the final shell company to a private offshore account. "This single transaction," he said softly, "was for you and Arthur to begin your new life." He looked back at Mr. Gable. The lawyer, as if on cue, cleared his throat and read the final line of my father's handwritten note. "Therefore," he read, "all remaining assets of my estate, including all real estate and, most importantly, the full legal authority to pursue criminal and civil prosecution for all fraudulent activities committed against my family's assets, I bequeath entirely to my daughter, Eleanor." The room was utterly silent. The only sound was the frantic, shallow breathing of my sister. Justice had not just been revealed. It had been delivered, wrapped in a will, and placed directly, unequivocally, into my hands. The silence that fell in the room was heavier than any sound. It was the sound of a 35-year-old lie collapsing under its own weight. Diane stared at the documents on the table, her face a canvas of disbelief that slowly curdled into pure, raw terror. The carefully constructed world she had built, the one she had boasted about just moments before, had been dismantled in less than 5 minutes. She made a small, choking sound, a wounded animal noise that came from deep within her chest. Arthur, stripped of his blustering confidence, looked like a cornered man, his eyes darting between Samuel, the lawyer, and the door, searching for an escape that did not exist. His empire was a house of cards, and the final card had just been pulled. Mr. Gable, his duty performed, spoke with a calm finality. "I believe our business here is concluded." He gestured toward the door. A silent, unequivocal dismissal. Arthur stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. He pulled a stunned, unresisting Diane to her feet. He shot me a look of pure, venomous hatred, a look that no longer held any power over me. They walked out of the office, not as the wealthy, sophisticated couple who had entered, but as two diminished figures, exposed and ruined. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, sealing their fate. Mr. Gable slid the final documents across the table toward me. The papers felt surprisingly light in my hands, holding the weight of decades, but feeling as thin as any other sheet of paper. They gave me the legal power to pursue my sister, to ensure she faced the full consequences of her actions, to strip away her last remaining defenses. In that moment, I held her future in my hands. I looked at the signature line on the document, the one waiting for my own name to set the legal machine in motion. I did not pick up the pen. The drive back to the inn with Samuel was quiet. It was not a tense silence, but a shared, peaceful one. The kind of quiet that comes after a long storm has finally passed. When we arrived, I walked through the familiar rooms of the inn, the place I had built from nothing. I ran my hand along the smooth, worn wood of the front desk. I breathed in the faint, clean scent of salt and old wood. This was real. This was mine. I went to my favorite room, the one with the large bay window that looked out over the endless expanse of the Atlantic. I watched the waves roll in, steady and eternal. Washing the shore clean again and again, I felt the anger, the resentment, the deep, aching pain that had been my silent companion for so many years, finally begin to recede. It was not the sharp, triumphant joy of revenge I felt. It was something deeper, calmer. It was peace. The truth had been spoken. My father had been honored. My own name had been cleared. The power to prosecute was mine. But the greater power was the freedom to not let their story be the final chapter of my own. I had the right to choose, and I chose to turn my face toward the open ocean, toward the rest of my life. Yes, you should absolutely include an audience interaction segment. It is crucial for engagement and building a loyal community. It allows the audience to connect with the story's themes on a personal level and transforms them from passive listeners into active participants. Thank you for joining me on this long journey. This story is a testament to the idea that truth has its own timeline, and sometimes the most profound justice is the peace we find within ourselves. I believe many of us have faced moments where we felt our story was being written by someone else. I would be honored to hear about a time in your own life where patience and holding on to your own truth eventually led to a moment of clarity or resolution. Please share your experiences in the comments below. Your stories give strength to others. And please subscribe for more stories of resilience and the quiet power of a life well lived.